Hi, thank you for joining me today. I'm here today to give you a brief introduction to how to mark controlled and classified information in documents. In this video, we will review briefly the importance of marking, the various components of marking documents, both mandatory and suggested practices, as well as some of the trickier parts of the process, like how to mark multiple pages or how to mark legacy information. To begin, let's review why it is so important to follow the policies which I am about to outline in this presentation. Although government agencies have been marking documents and protecting information for decades, not everyone was using the same acronyms or labels to codify information. Consider this analogy. One department may have been speaking German while another is fluent in French. The purpose of the CUI program is to be our sort of Rosetta Stone, to set forth a common language that we may all communicate about CUI. The first step to marking CUI is to include the Designation Indicator. Consider this a sort of return address. At minimum, it should include the agency from which the CUI document originated. A best practice, however, would be to also include the name and contact information of the point person from the agency from which the CUI document originated. This step is essential as it is important for the receiving agency to know who to contact if they have any questions regarding the CUI contained in the document. The inclusion of a designation indicator ensures open communication between agencies regarding CUI and the proper handling of controlled and classified information. Another mandatory step in the CUI process is the creation of a banner marking. The banner marking is found at the top of the document and indicates that the document being received contains controlled and classified information. It is mandatory to include this marking because it alerts the recipient that they are in possession of CUI and therefore must take care to handle it differently than they would any other kind of information. Photo markings are optional, but must be used identically to the banner marking if used. To further expand on the uses of controlled unclassified information banner marking, let's discuss category and subcategory markings. To better clarify to the recipient what category or subcategory of CUI is contained in the document, you can include the category or subcategory in the CUI banner marking at the top. Though this is not a mandatory practice, it is a highly suggested one. To include a category, you must place a double / following the acronym CUI or word controlled. Remember that control marking can be the word controlled or CUI. If you are including a subcategory, there is no need to include the main category. To review, you must have a control marking. If multiple categories or subcategories are being included in the banner marking, they may be separated using a single / and listed alphabetically. Markings for all categories and subcategories can be found on the CUI registry. Once an agency is trained, they will be alerted to what acronyms, subcategories, and categories they tend to use the most in their own document marking. In the example on the slide, the particular CUI being identified is critical infrastructure, represented by the acronym CRIT, and water assessment, which is a subcategory represented as WATER. Before we continue, it is prudent to draw an important distinction between CUI Basic and CUI Specified. CUI Basic refers to any category or subcategory of CUI that by law, regulation, or government-wide policy is identified to be protected, but there is no further information on how to protect that information. CUI Specified refers to any category or subcategory of CUI where the underlying law, regulation, or government-wide policy not only identified what to protect, but also specified some other handling required with that CUI. This can mean that it has dissemination controls, that only certain parties may receive that CUI. For instance, in some cases, CUI may not be reached by any foreign nationals. Since CUI Specified has slightly different controls than CUI Basic, it must be denoted in a CUI banner marking. Therefore, all categories or subcategories that are specified must be listed in the banner marking with an SP- preceding its acronym. The categories and subcategories are separated in the banner marking from the control marking with a double /. One can find out if CUI is specified using the CUI registry. Additionally, once an agency undergoes training, they will often be taught what specified categories they are most likely to use when marking a document. If CUI is listed in the registry as specified, it is mandatory to note it as such in the banner marking. Consider the example on screen. The CUI being included in the document is privacy information. Since this is specified according to the CUI registry, it is listed as being specified in the banner marking with an SP- preceding its acronym of PRVCY. To clarify, marking subcategories and categories is not required for CUI Basic, but it is still highly suggested. Limited dissemination controls, like categories and subcategories, can be added to the CUI banner marking. They are also not mandatory, but a highly suggested practice, as they can be used to convey any limited dissemination controls needed when handling that CUI. If you choose to include limited dissemination control markings in the banner, they must appear as the last two elements of the banner marking, and they are separated from any other elements by 2 /. If a banner contains multiple limited dissemination control markings, they can be separated from one another using a single /. Consider the example on screen. The specified category here is SPXXX, and the limited dissemination control is no foreign dissemination, represented by no foreign. See the CUI registry for a list of all approved limited dissemination control markings that may be used in a CUI document. Another practice that is highly suggested for the point of clarity is portion marking. Though it is not mandatory, portion marking is extremely helpful because it clarifies for the recipient which portions of the document contain controlled unclassified information and therefore should be handled with care. Portion markings are placed in parentheses before the paragraph in which information is contained. As you can see on screen, U's are placed in parentheses before any paragraph that contains uncontrolled unclassified information. CUI is placed in parentheses before any paragraph that contains controlled unclassified information. If portion markings are used in one part of the document, they must be used throughout. That is to say, they must be used for every paragraph within the document. The practice of portion marking can be applied to a category or subcategory markings and to limited dissemination control markings as well. Again, this is not a mandatory but a highly suggested practice, as it alerts the recipient to how they should handle with care every different part of the document. Should you decide to portion mark and include limited dissemination control markings, be sure to separate them from any other elements with 2 /. Another situation that could be a bit tricky when it comes to marking CUI is when you have to mark multiple pages that contain different types of CUI. The way to address this issue is to craft a CUI banner marking on that first page, which contains the CUI contained throughout the entire document. That is to say, even if a form of CUI is not necessarily on the primary page of the document, it is still reflected in the banner marking on the top of that first page. In the example below, notice that certain CUI cannot be found on the first page, like SPXXXX. However, SPXXX is still included in the banner marking. This banner marking will be reflected on the first page and on every page of the document. Frequently, agencies will collaborate on documents and forms and will therefore send them to each other before they are finalized. However, even in an unfinished state, if a document contains controlled unclassified information, that CUI must be handled with standard protections. Therefore, if you need to mark a document containing CUI as a draft, you should still follow the normal procedure of marking CUI within the banner. However, you may also include a label of draft somewhere in the document so long as it does not commingle with the CUI banner marking. That is to say, you may use other administrative markings, like a watermark, to reflect the draft status of your document. For the sake of clarity, any administrative marking should be clearly distinguished from the CUI banner, and consider the example on the screen. The example that is crossed out is one in which draft is contained as part of the banner marking. This is confusing as the draft status of this document is unrelated to the treatment of CUI. Since the two are unrelated, draft should be separated from the banner marking as in the example to the right. Thank you again for joining us today. If you have any further questions regarding how to mark CUI, please visit the CUI registry for further educational materials or reach out to the Office of Controlled Unclassified Information.